Hello, everyone, and welcome to the series of literary theory under 10 minutes. So, today our issue is new criticism, which is the first literary theory that we come across in the 20th century. All right, so this is the first theory that we come across in the 20th century. Now, what was so very new about new criticism? Let's first try to determine that. New criticism was new because it did away with one major thing. That is, before new criticism, all forms of criticism were to a certain extent subjective. And that's why they were called literary criticism and not literary theory. Alright, so it was the critic's subjective interpretation, whereas now we have a theory which has clear cut tenets which we can use. So there are clear cut tenets which everybody can use and not just one critic or one school of critics. Okay. Now, new criticism, the term was first introduced by J.A. Spingarn in 1929. 2 years later, that is in 1931, there was a book of the same name by Cleanth Brooks, and therefore new criticism made it start from there. Now, let's try to understand the basics of new criticism. Okay, what was new criticism talking about? The first tenet, if I say, was the text itself. That is, new criticism focused on the text. Why? Because it was influenced by two critics of the previous generation. One was Matthew Arnold, the other was T.S. Eliot. Both of them talked about a sense of impersonality. That is, where the poet or the critic does not bulge in the text. So, new criticism therefore focused on what is written on the page. And therefore, many critics believe that new criticism was a kind of formalism because it focused on the form of language which was used. All right. And therefore, new criticism denied the author's intention. Why? Look, number one is that most authors do not write their intention. Number two is, even if they write their intention, they say what they intended and not what they could achieve. So therefore, it is impossible to quite determine that what exactly the author was trying to do with the text. Because sometimes it so happens that the author does not foresee how beautiful the text would become or how important the text would become. Sometimes the author overestimates the text and so on and so forth. So therefore, it is impossible to quite justify the author's intention, and therefore it was denied. Moreover, the reader's intention, say I am reading a text which is a very happy text, say I am reading a love story and I have just had a breakup, and I am seeing that in that story everybody is having a happy ending. Now I would feel that that story is rubbish. Or say I am reading a very sad text, say a text about death or so on and so forth, and I am in a very happy mood, and I would think, oh, life is not so glum, not so boring, etc., etc. So what happens over here is that my appreciation is dependent on my psychological condition, on my mood, and therefore my reading is not objective enough, and therefore the reader's intention was not taken into consideration. All right. So let us now move from here to the next tenets. Now, the new critics talked about the autotelic text. This word comes from the Greek word telos, which means an ending. Okay. So the text is the be all and the end all. That is what the new critics wanted to propose. That is, the text has its own meaning irrespective of the author and the reader. Therefore, what the new critics were trying to mean was that the text was a function of language, because the text is coded in language, right? It is written in language, and therefore it is a function of language. Now, what kind of language it is? The new critics specified that it was literary language. What is literary language? If we have to understand literary language, then we have to understand it against the language of everyday use and the scientific language. There are three kinds of language which we primarily deal with. Now, the language of everyday use is primarily there for communication. All right. So we try to communicate the basic necessities by the language of everyday use. Whereas scientific language kind of states facts. It is more concerned with stating facts, truths, verities, etc. So the basically the scientific findings. Whereas the literary language has a special function, that is, it has an aesthetic turn. And therefore it employs rhetoric, it employs imagery, it employs a lot of things. And excuse me, the new critics believed that this aesthetic turn of the literary language is what sets it apart from the scientific language or the language of everyday use. And therefore, they said that a text is that specific text because of its language, its use of literary language. So, if I change a single word, the text would lose its value. And therefore, they were against paraphrase. They said that imagine I am paraphrasing a poem. Now, I will paraphrase it into prose. That means I am taking away from the poem not only its language, but also its form. Now, therefore, the new critics would believe that I am not doing justifying, I'm not doing any justification with the poem. I'm not being just with the poem. Similarly, if it's a paraphrase of a novel, I'll be paraphrasing it in 2 or 3 pages max. Now, if I do that, I am taking away from the novel all the things that are important to it, and I am giving a bare skeleton. Now, imagine all of us have a bare skeleton, but that does not make us who we are. It is the external things which kind of make us what we look like, right? So, therefore, they were against paraphrase. So, how do we read a text according to new criticism? They proposed close reading. What is close reading? A close reading is an intensive encounter with the language of the text, because whatever is written on the page is the language, the words. And how do we do it? We focus on the imagery, we focus on the ambiguity, we focus on the paradox, we focus on the irony, and we focus on such issues which otherwise were kind of ignored. Why is this so very important? Why do we focus on the figures of speech, the images, symbols, rhythms, rhymes, interaction between the words? Why? Because the new before new criticism, what happened was that the norm was of something which is called a biographical criticism. Okay. Now, in a biographical criticism, what happened was that the author's life, his other works, even letters, correspondences, etc., were looked for meaning of the text. And often, in extremes, it would lead to not reading the text itself. So the text was seen as a corollary of the author's life lived. So the lived experience of the author was considered to be represented through the text, and on many occasions the text was not read. Therefore, the new critics said that get rid of the author in the first place, And let's read the text, because the text is a self-contained identity. When they said this, they kind of brought a very interesting way of reading a text. That is, they said a text emits four kinds of meanings. All right. What are these four kinds of meanings? Basically, whenever we read a text, we are concerned with its meaning. And whether we speak, write, read, or listen, there is a summation of these four kinds of meanings in a text. So, what are they? First is sense. Sense is basically when we are trying to communicate with someone, whatever we say or whatever we present before them, that is the sense. Next comes the feeling. What does the feeling mean? Feeling is the attitude towards what we are conveying, that is the subject. Our attitude towards the subject, that is our biases. All right. Third is the tone. This is our attitude towards the listener. So, this is our attitude towards the subject. This is our attitude towards the listener. And finally comes intention. Intention can be conscious or it can be unconscious. Intention is basically the purpose of a statement. Okay. For instance, say whenever a politician says, "Bhaiyon or behno," you know some bamboo is coming your way. So these are the four kinds of meaning that we have to think about. Now we come to paradox. Paradox is a very interesting thing. It comes from two Greek words. One is para and the other is doxa. Para means another and doxa means public opinion. Both are Greek words. Okay. So paradox or paradoxa, this means another public opinion. This is a lesser known version. So paradox often allows for multiple meanings, and it is believed that paradox is the language which is well suited for poetry. Why? Let us take one example. Say Wordsworth's lines written on Westminster Bridge. Now, apparently, it seems that there are two binaries presented here. So, Westminster Bridge, there are two binaries presented here. One is nature and one is culture, because it is talking about London. So, on one hand, we have nature, on one hand, we have culture, and we think that they are in antagonism. But actually, in this poem, according to the new critics, Wordsworth is saying that nature is great. But culture is also great because it is man made and man is part of nature. So, man is a creation of nature. And man has created culture, and therefore, nature is great, but culture is also great. If that is the case, then the language of paradox in multiple cases becomes very important as a language of poetry. Next, we come to a very interesting issue. I'm just talking about the issues in general, okay? I'm not going very deeply because we have to finish it very quickly. I'm just talking about the crux of new criticism. Now we come to tension. Tension is a formulation of these two ideas, intention and extension. What does this mean? Now, whenever we are studying something, say whenever we are studying a novel or a short story or a poem, we see that there are two kinds of meanings. One is a surface meaning and one is a deep inner meaning, right? So there are two kinds of meanings. Now, the surface meaning is basically denotative. That is, it denotes, it kind of states facts. Say he went there at 7 o'clock, it was raining, he was in a glum mood, etc., etc., etc. These are facts of a text. Whereas he went there at 7 o'clock, it was raining, he was in a glum mood, and the rain and the glum mood are being connected by us. That is the connotative meaning, which is the deep inner meaning. Now, The new critic suggested that the intention refers to the connotative meaning, whereas the extension refers to the denotative meaning. That is, the intention of the text is spoken about in the connotative meaning. That is, the text connotes its intention, whereas the text denotes its extension. That is, the facts, the figures, they are the extensions, and the deep inner meaning, whatever it connotes, is the intention. All right. Now, based on this, the new critics divided poetry into three groups. One was physical, one was Platonic, one was metaphysical. The physical poetry is about all the physical objects, the objects that we see around us. Okay. It is about the physical objects or the things in language and not in idea. All right. There is the things we can put in language, say a square box, a red sofa. These are objects which we can properly denote. So they suggested that this is pure poetry because we can see the objects, we can feel the objects through our five senses. Whereas in Platonic poetry, the idea is the main and the objects go to the backdrop. So it deals with ideas and not really objects. Now, if you read most of the Romantic and the Victorian poems, you'll see that they are of this category. For instance, imagine Shelley says, "Hail to the blithe spirit, bird thou never wert." So a bird is flying in front of you, and you are saying, "Hail to the blithe spirit, bird thou never wert." So you are denying the object its objective existence, and you are taking it to the domain of ideas. So similarly, this is Platonic. Whereas in metaphysical poetry, we have two ideas. One is reason, and the other is feeling. Reason needs support, it needs basically material support. So it is the objective world or the physical poetry. And feeling does not need any form of backup, it's an idea. So it is in the Platonic way. So metaphysical poetry is a blend of both. So these are the three kinds of poems according to new criticism. Now let's come to the most important thing, which is practical criticism. In the 1930s, there was a professor in Cambridge whose name was I.A. Richards, Ivor Armstrong Richards. What he did was he simply took a poem. He did not give the title, nor did he give the name of the author. And he asked the students to critique those poems. Because basically, the way of scholarship was very poor back in those days. People simply focused on the biographies of the authors, what the authors have said, what the authors have written, etc., etc. And therefore, they said that, sorry, Richard said that, sorry, you critique these poems without having anything. So, what do is you read this poem, you look for the images, you look for rhetoric, you look for the prosody that is being followed over here, you look for the ambiguities. Now, ambiguity is a major issue in new criticism, and I have deliberately skipped it because that would take a lot of time. If I have to explain ambiguity, that would take half an hour. So I have deliberately skipped ambiguity. You need to understand the paradox, and so on and so forth. So when you do this, you get a criticism of this poem. Say, look, twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. So if the rhyme scheme is A, here is A. High sky, star are, gone upon, light night, star are. So it is in a rhyming couplet. Star R, it's going to be again CC, not FF. So it is in rhyming couplet, and look how many lines are there: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So it's a 12-line poem. If there were two more, we could have called it a sonnet. But it's not a sonnet. So it is a nursery poem from the simple words, and there is a repetition of the word twinkle, the T sound over here, and therefore we know it is alliteration. How I wonder what you are, and so on and so forth. So whenever we analyze this poem, just like we did in rhetoric, in prosody, whenever we look at the images, that is here, there is the image of the star, there is the image of the diamond, there is the there are several rhetorical features over here. If you do the prosody, then you will get some idea of how it is done. Say, twinkle, twinkle, little star. So it's mainly in trochaic. So therefore, then there is a lot of ambiguity. I'll not talk about this deliberately. Then there is a language of paradox. The star is being compared to diamond. So when the blazing sun is gone, the sun and the star, they are pitched against, and so on and so forth. So whenever you do all of this, you get an idea of how to do practical criticism. In this regard, I would ask you to read the same book, the book of the same name by this guy, I.A. Richards. It's widely available, and it should be a kind of a holy grail, a kind of a Bible for all the students who are trying to understand poetry. Also, there is another book which I always ask the students to read: Principles of Literary Criticism. It is also by the same person. Now, New Criticism was criticized, it was critiqued heavily for being, uh, for kind of taking a text without its context, out of its context, and therefore it was heavily critiqued. But what New Criticism very interestingly did was it first brought our focus to the text. Until now, in your schools, colleges, universities, whenever you focus on the text, you are doing, in effect, New Criticism. So, therefore, it is a very important theory in itself. Although you might agree with it, you might disagree with it, and now New Criticism is no longer practiced in the critical world, but in academia, it is still the norm of the day. So, with this, I'll end this discussion. I had wanted originally to talk about New Criticism in less than 10 minutes, and now I have crossed almost 23 minutes. But I hope that gives you some idea. So thank you so much. Have a great day.